I was going to ask Cordelia to talk a little bit more about something that she's been working on specifically, which is a really great resource that I think is interesting, which is just thinking a little bit about how do we specifically teach the Reformed tradition to our kids. And that's kind of a charge that she's been given, has been thinking a little bit more about. So if you could just briefly, for a couple minutes, touch on that.
Sure. Well, as I shared at the beginning, we're going to a single curriculum in which all the age groups are going to be studying the same story on the same Sunday. And one of the reasons that we're doing that is because we've become very aware that we have an extremely theologically diverse congregation. And we also have become aware of how much our theology is influenced by the media and a lot of mixed messages that are out there, some of which we take from Dante and medieval Catholicism, and some of which we take from kind of a Jonathan Edwards. Am I saying that right? I'm trying to I keep wanting to say Jonathan Winters. I know that's wrong. Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and how those ideas get brought into our churches, and those are not a part of the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition is one that is full of a lot of grace and of love. And I have to say that I have lived 10 years in the buckle of the Bible Belt, not just the Bible Belt, the buckle of the Bible Belt, and over 20 years in the South. And so as I share this, if you want to look at it, I'll say that this is such a different part of the country, and this is such a different religious environment that if I have missed a balance that's appropriate for this area, I hope you will consider this a working document and one that can be improved. I was a director of Christian education in a church that was right next to a youth house that was called the Firehouse, and they put up signs like "turn or burn." And that was just really a regular part of the Christian witness that was common in the communities that I lived in Alabama and Texas and Florida. My husband's a Boeing engineer, so we've been Boeing around. Anyway, so I began to see how many times we use phrases that are not consistent with Reformed theology, like, well, God must have taken your mom because he needed another angel in his choir. God must have given your uncle, I heard this last week from somebody in our Sunday school, God must have given cancer to your uncle because his faith is so strong, and God knew he could handle it, and he would witness to his faith in the middle of this cancer. This man is wasted to nothing. You can see the tumors under his skin through his shirt. He's in a lot of pain. And so I went back, my pastor asked me to create a document that would talk about what do we teach at different age levels, what do we want our children to understand. And I remember this wonderful book that was given to me at a Synod of the Southeast workshop by the children's pastor at Peachtree Presbyterian Church, which is an outstanding, large Presbyterian church. And this was a result of a 2-year study that the entire congregation did, and that the session also engaged in a study. And it lists their theological principles, guidelines by age, Bible information that they want kids to learn, what they want kids to know about worship and sacraments, stewardship and mission, etc., church history, etc. And it has helped me as a Christian educator, but I found that when you give a document like this to teachers who are so busy and who are probably preparing their lesson on Saturday night, they just go, thanks, but I'll read it later, really. And 4 years later, they probably didn't get to it, and I don't blame them. I really, really get that. I'd like to ask how many of you are familiar with this book, Christian Doctrine by Dr. Shirley Guthrie. Anybody? Oh, I am so glad to see that. No one in my church had ever heard of this book. Not even my pastor, but anyway. This is a common book in adult education in the South and the Southeast. Dr. Shirley Guthrie was a professor of, I think it was systematic theology at Columbia Theological Presbyterian Seminary. And he goes through all the doctrines of the Reformed tradition. And because this was a college textbook is how it originally started, he tries to show the different historical and theological perspectives on each doctrine, as well as the unchurched perspectives.
You mean Calvinism when you say Reformed tradition?
Well, that's a great question, and if you don't mind, I would just say it is more than Calvinism. It's the tradition of the Reformed churches, which is wider than Calvin, but Calvin was a very important part of that. And I'm not a pastor, so I'm not sure that I'm qualified to totally answer that question, but I hope that helped.
I don't know either.
So when my pastor asked me to do this, I thought, how can I create something that is hopefully helpful to a Sunday school teacher that they will actually read, that also is faithful to the Reformed tradition? And so what I did was I took each of the doctrines that he talks about, and I tried to create you have one of these already. I tried to create a table. I'm so thankful to be able to bounce ideas off this incredible lady. To create a table that suggests how we might talk about these issues at a preschool level, an early elementary level, a mid-elementary, and a late elementary level. And this is really intended, I just brought 10 copies because I didn't know how helpful it would be to people, but I can always email it to you if you want to. This was really intended for each level to build one on the other. And, I don't want to claim that this is perfect. My pastor has looked at every line of it and was very pleased with it. But the reason that I share it with you is, and I'll ask you if you don't mind to read it later, is because I think it's really important for all of us to think through, what do I really believe, and is my faith consistent? And is what I am teaching kids about God's sovereignty and God's grace, is it consistent? And so, the other piece of this that I guess I would just like to add is, because the church is shrinking, and because kids want to give us the right answer, but so often later on, when you ask them, what does that mean, you find that not only do kids not really understand, but a lot of adults really don't understand. That we have used certain phrases over and over again that we probably understand, but that kids, they give you that answer because it's the right answer, but it still doesn't make sense to them. Why on earth did God allow Jesus to be hurt by those mean people? Why didn't he stop that? Because he loves us. Why did Jesus have to die? Because God loves us. This just does not make sense to kids. It's confusing and upsetting. We don't let our kids go to R-rated movies. And what is the crucifixion story if it's not an R-rated movie? And so what's really easy for us to do is to dilute the gospel into, little sayings that are sweet. And then when kids ask uncomfortable questions, to try to just move past them really quickly. So how can we be faithful? And then I just thought I'd share a little bit about my own journey, because I have just been consumed with trying to explain faith in a way that is as real and as relatable to kids as possible, so that they can connect it to their real life. I bought my coffee on the way in here, and the lady at that sells me the coffee every morning, she said, I'm really an outsider when it comes to church, because you keep talking about all these names that I've never heard of, all these places I've never heard of, all these people who are related to each other, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and I don't know who they are, and I don't get it. And I just said, thank you for being honest enough to share that with me. And so that's a part of my struggle to try to make sharing the gospel as relatable to kids as possible. And here's some of the ways that I had done that. I was exposed to the monumental scholarship, and oh my goodness, scholarship, of Dr. Kenneth E. Bailey. This is not easy to read, but it is profound. He's a Presbyterian pastor and scholar who lived in the Middle East for decades, and who has helped to interpret what Jesus did through the lens of the Middle East and through the lens of his time. There's a wonderful book called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes. He's got a movie about the prodigal son as maybe told by Arab Christians. I found it really profoundly eye-opening to understand. I also was fortunate enough to visit Israel on a Christian education trip. And I started out just looking at these sites as archaeological sites. You know, you go from one site to the next. And I had some profound experiences that changed how I teach. I teach kids that we all need a hero and we all need a mentor. We're all looking to figure out what we're going to build our life upon. And Jesus is the best mentor that you can possibly imagine. And Jesus is not some barefoot, illiterate itinerant who was living out in the hills of Galilee. He was the son of a migrant worker. He lived in Nazareth. Why does no good thing come out of Nazareth? Because it was close to SeaPres, which was a Roman garrison. It would be like living outside of Bellingham, I think. You know, you've got a military site, you've got people who are far away from home, where Uncle Guido and Grandma are not watching, and your cousin can't tattle on you, and there's all kinds of bad parts of town where single men are working hard during the day and playing hard at night. That's where Jesus grew up. Jesus grew up in a faithful family in a town next to SeaPres, where if you go there, you will see archaeological ruins of mosaics of Roman orgies and Roman myths. Jesus was the son of a carpenter, a tekton, which means stonemason and carpenter. Do you think that Joseph took his sons with him that 2-mile walk to where the work was? Do you think that Jesus helped to learn how to sell their wares? How could you sell anything to Romans if you didn't speak their language? Did they speak Aramaic? They probably spoke Greek. SeaPres was a community in which people were coming from all over the place. All I'm saying is I've tried to enrich the kids' understanding of that Jesus is not somebody who's an icon or a saint. He was a real kid who grew up in a difficult neighborhood, maybe in a bad neighborhood, but in a faithful family that helped him to hold on to his faith and strengthen his faith in the middle of getting to know people who were very different from him, people who lived very different lifestyles. And then Jesus lived there 30 years as a carpenter. That means he was a small businessman. Mm-hmm. Do you think he was a bad carpenter? No. I bet he worked hard. I bet he produced quality work. I bet he got along well with people. I bet he was the kind of worker that when he was in your home was somebody that you couldn't stop talking to because he was such a good listener and because he was a wise man. Turns out the carpenters in Israel at that time were known as the scholars within the Jewish trade community. You know, he was not like the immigrant from South America who is trying to just learn our language and mow our lawns to make money. He was a small businessman who was a trained and a skilled person. And then when he decided to give up his business to go into full-time ministry, and you see, I'm just trying to share a little bit about things that I have learned through Dr. Ken Bailey about Jesus' life in the Middle East and a Middle Eastern understanding of Jesus that are, I think, fresh. and that hopefully help us to tell the stories in fresh ways, so that we don't fall into the trap of using the same phrases again and again. It forces us to look at our faith again. What do I believe? What did Jesus believe in? Who did Jesus love? Who did Jesus serve? And that takes us into very different ways of looking at Jesus, and hopefully keeps the story fresh. I had a thought when you were talking about family. Did Jesus come from a dysfunctional family? You know, his mother and his brothers were upset with him at certain times. On the cross, he asked his disciple to take care of his mother. So perhaps in that story, as well as another connecting point, that the church family is a different kind of family, and a very valuable family, and that the role of friends, Christian friends, can be so profound, that it was family to Jesus. And of course, the end of the story being that Jesus' brother and Jesus' mother were disciples, at the end. And so there was reconciliation that sometimes people then didn't understand Jesus immediately at times, sometimes even in his own family, but that wasn't the end of the story. So what I try to do is, this errs on the side of grace. It errs on the side of love. It errs on the side of forgiveness. It doesn't talk so much about punishment and about salvation and about atonement, even though I was forced to deal with those topics because they are in the essential tenets of the Reformed faith. And it was a valuable exercise for me. What do I really believe? And so I encourage you to do that as well. But I will just say that this was informed from a perspective of trying to encourage children to fall in love with Jesus. Meet him. Get to know who he was. Be impressed by what kind of man he was. What kind of man he must have been, from what we can glean and think about when you know more about his childhood and his youth. When you fall in love, it's because you have come to respect somebody, and you've wanted to spend more time with them, and you've eventually wanted to commit to them. And when you're that in love, and when you're that committed, you would give your life for that person, whether that is your spouse or your child. And that is the point at which I think children will come to commit to Jesus on this profound level. In listening to Children on the Spiritual Journey, I don't know if you recommended this one to me or what, one of the things they talk about is that children who are first exposed to a stern, judgmental, angry God, apparently, statistically, according to some studies, are more likely to hide their sins from God, and I would guess to lie to their parents as well. The children that are raised in a family and in a church in which they are loved and encouraged to feel safe, being normal human beings who go through growth, which includes learning and making mistakes, are much more comfortable being honest with God about their shortcomings than those raised in other ways. So I invite you to join with me in this dialogue if you want to. You can also have it in an electronic form. It's not perfect, but you might consider also thinking through these things for yourself, because it will deepen your love for God, and it will enrich your ministry.
There is one thing, excuse me, you didn't tell us. So, what do you tell kids why the uncle got cancer?
Why what? Why the uncle got cancer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we talk about that we live in a fallen, sinful world with limitations. We talk about that this is not heaven, that in heaven there will be no pain and no sickness and no death and no suffering. That God does not promise us that nothing bad will happen to us in this life, and all we have to do is look at Jesus to see that that's the truth. Even really good people in this life experience injustice and pain and death. like Jesus did. What God promises us is not that nothing bad will ever happen to us. What God promises us is that he will walk with us through it. And when Jesus faced his crucifixion, the way I teach, I've talked to parents about, well, how should you talk to kids about the crucifixion and the resurrection? And what I say is that Jesus, when he was in that position, was faced with a couple really difficult options. What are our options? Do you run away when people are bullying you? Do you give in and say, okay, never mind, I didn't mean it, and join in with the people that are doing the bad things? Do you fight back? Jesus didn't do any of those things. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Jesus lived it on a profound level. He didn't fight back. There's something kids can understand about the crucifixion story. Jesus handled it with strength and dignity as a gentleman, one who knew the outcome of the story. He took the bad treatment because he knew that in the end, love is stronger than hate, and love is even stronger than death. And in the end, love always wins because all love is from God. That's how I try to make that crucifixion story important to kids instead of being frightening, off-putting, and confusing.
Is sickness, is sickness brought by Satan or by God?
I don't believe that Satan is brought by sickness, by Satan or by God. I think sickness is a part of the human condition. It happens, and God helps us to deal with it. And I realize there are places in the Old Testament in which it talks about sickness being brought from God. I realize that. But Jesus also healed people that were lame and talked about disasters that happened and specifically said they were not caused by somebody's sin and they were not caused by death. So I keep my focus on Jesus is where I keep my focus.